So we'll continue with Genesis and 12 to 50, and we'll talk about genres because we did that last time. So hopefully, again, some of these things are reinforcing concepts we've learned from previous classes. And so the type of genres you'll find is Old Testament historical narrative, wisdom literature, poetry. And I mean this across the Old Testament, not just Genesis, although you'll find elements of these in Genesis, and prophecy. And so we're going to zero in on the Old Testament historical narrative. These are dramatic stories of both historical and theological substance that contain things like speeches, dialogues, and they comprise scenes or episodes which together make up the whole story. And so we're going to look into this in this section. We'll look at Joseph, and we'll look at some of the rules of interpreting historical narrative, which would be not that different from when we looked at the Gospels. So hopefully you remember that. So this is Joseph and the Potiphar's wife. And so we'll read through Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearances. After a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or go or be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. As soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment and beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So when we look at this narrative, this is an incredible episode in Joseph's life. And so when we consider the history, we look at Joseph's family history, his genogram, and you can find this in the study Bible. I think this one is from the CSB study Bible. And you look at the genealogy of Joseph, kind of traces it down to what you find is something fascinating. There's like a parallels between his mom and him. Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So there's this sort of family connection that you see. And then you also want to look at Joseph's own history. And I'll tell you why. Because, for example, you look at this story and you're doing a teen devotional and you look at Joseph's life and you look at this incredible choice that he has made. It's remarkable, in terms of honoring God, honoring Potiphar, and not succumbing to the temptation. But that's only part of it. And that's part of these historical narratives. You want a multi-dimensional character formation, because the Bible presents multi-dimensional characters. And so if you look at the history of Joseph, in Genesis 37:2, we read about Jacob's family life. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the son of Bilhah and sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So he's telling on his brothers. And now he continues, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of this dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 7 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And then we continue on, so we see this part of his life, which, as you can see, imagine, is not wise and was full of folly and pride. And then we continue on with this story in Genesis 37:19. Here comes the dreamer. They said to each other, come, let us kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robes, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed, so when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So again, getting some historical perspective of his genealogy and his character helps to kind of round off a little more of who Joseph is. And then when we look at the genre of historical narrative, again, think of a movie, because that's probably a good analogy for us, a good comparative illustration. When you watch a movie, there's a hero, there's a villain, and there's characters in the movie. And so it's similar when we're reading a historical narrative. Who's the protagonist or the hero of the story? Who's the antagonist, the villain? Who's the foil? A foil is a person who contrasts to another in the story. And so you get to see a compare and contrast. And it's looking at the narrative from different points of view. So for example, going back to Joseph and Potiphar's wife, when you're doing a teen devotional or campus devotional, you can speak to the men, right? And you can say, look at Joseph's character, look at how he handled temptation. But what about the women? What are you women supposed to do with that story? Like because you cast in the role of Potiphar's wife. Like, it's all the women's fault. They're wearing all these low neck clothes and these short skirts, and is that what that story is about? Because I don't know how, and I'd love to hear your thoughts during the response time. How do you hear that story? Because there's a story being told. But also, if you look at the foil of the Potiphar's wife, who is the contrasting character? And I think the story is supposed to be read in light of Judah and Tamar. But even there, what is a woman supposed to do with Tamar's story? Like, don't be a prostitute or be a prostitute? We're not sure what's supposed to happen there. So you're having these interesting. That's part of our story. We have to engage with the text and go into that story and try to figure out, let's look at the different points of view. What is Potiphar's wife's point of view in the story? What is she doing? What is the text doing with her? And then you trace back to Eve herself, like what's the story you're supposed to tell, or what's the lesson for the sisters in this? Like, don't be like Eve, don't be like Tamar, or be like Tamar. I don't know what that means. Am I supposed to go prostitute myself? I don't think that's a good lesson. But that's part of the wrestle with the text. Is this a patriarchal? Because that's what it is. It's men writing this. So let's get up in arms and fight all the men, and we'll start our own women's church, and no men allowed. But you understand, that's part of we have to wrestle with. That's part of the narratives that we have to engage with, the points of view. And why is that point of view being presented? First of all, the Bible doesn't even tell you, is this noble, is this not noble, is this right, it's not wrong, is it wrong? It's just telling us a story. And so we have to look at the start, conflict, resolution. What's the struggle that's being presented? Does that make sense? Like, that makes it really come alive. And so again, to answer some of those questions, I think the Potiphar's wife is telling us giving us a perspective of Genesis 3 verse 6. And the foil is Tamar, and Joseph's foil is Judah, and you're seeing men and women. Tamar being, for the woman, in her way, in her culture, being righteous in a way that Judah is not, and Judah is doing what a failed image bearer would do. Joseph is an example of what a man is doing as God's image bearer, and Potiphar's wife is doing what Judah is doing to Tamar. So there's all these interesting parallels that you're supposed to gain from the story. It's not indictments against a gender. It's telling us stories of human beings have failed miserably to be God's image bearer, and yet there's hope. Yet there are people making choices within the environment and culture and challenges that they are faced with to uphold God's to uphold God's image-bearing vocation. Yeah. So again, it's so important because, and I was thinking about this story, and that's why I thought of the teen devotional. What story? What are we teaching the girls, our children? And I can say that I'm old enough. You guys are gonna, possibly could be my kids, but it's important because we have to teach. That's where I think we have to really do a better job of presenting the gospel to all, not just the men. And we have to really challenge our own constructs of purity and how to present that to young girls, to young boys, to young men, young women, and really present the whole of it, so that we don't have these one-dimensional characterizations. Men are all good, men are all bad, women are all good, women are all bad. Potiphar's wife becomes sort of the symbol of this, women that will lead men astray. Oh no, watch out for the women, and those are all incredibly terrible characterizations, and that's not what the narrative is even doing. So it's on us to, when we teach, which you'll teach campus men, campus women, teens, that you're presenting the whole thing and helping the young people, helping each other really come to this, come to a more fuller understanding. I know that's incorrect grammar. It's not more fuller, it's just fuller understanding. But, it's emphasis on more fuller. The theology of Joseph's story, and again, I've just used 3C and 3D as a template. Our connection with God. You see that the Lord was with Joseph, Genesis 39 verse 2, so that he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So we see this high connection with Joseph that God has with Joseph. But we also see this connection with others. When in Genesis 39 verse 3 and 4, when his master saw the Lord was with him and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. So we see this incredible connection with God results in connection with others. And then the mission, which only comes clear over time. In Genesis 45, verse 4, brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there have been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So we see this connection with mission, which also, again, like I said, wasn't clear at first, but becomes more apparent. And afterwards he can look back and say, I know why all those bad things happened to me. And there's the challenge. How does this challenge us? Challenge us in our relationship with God, with each other, with our mission that we have. It's an incredible narrative of there's so many lessons to be gleaned. And then change. Transformation is from the Lord. Here's a great question to reflect. How did God change Joseph through suffering? Which I'll be the first to admit, I do not like suffering. It's just not something that I want to go through. Yeah. But Joseph went through terrible suffering. And how did that transform him? How does this change us in our relationship with God? What do we do when we go through episodes of pride and and being rebuked by those in our community, which is what happened with him and his brothers. What do we do when we're in those spaces where we are unfairly treated, where what we get is not what we deserve at all? We've done the right thing, and yet we get the wrong thing. How does this change us in our relationship with each other and in our relationship with the mission? So there's so much to glean from these narratives. So I just want to close out with some just simple principles in reading historical narratives. The first one is just to keep in mind the hermeneutic triad. It's a really helpful tool to think of the history, literature, theology. Consider the canon, which we haven't when we look at Joseph's story, but a canonical reading is helpful. How does Joseph's story connect with the New Testament? For example, read the appropriate section of passage. Again, we saw that, right? We looked at Joseph and Potiphar's wife, but we kind of looked a little bit more into his character and a little bit ahead. So historical narratives are great opportunities to really do that. Read the surrounding narratives. As I mentioned, Judah and Tamar, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. It's meant to be read parallel to each other. Enter the world of the narrative. And if you have an imagination, this is fun. Get into the world of the narrative. Even if you don't have an imagination, imagine it's a movie. Imagine it's a movie, and place yourself in the scene. What's going on? What's happening? What are some details that you pick up? And why is it there? And again, point of view. Look at from different perspectives, and so it's a lot of fun. Now I'll just have to say this. I know some of these things are not scripturally mentioned. Like, we don't know why Potiphar's wife did this, and so we have to kind of be careful we don't make it a dogmatic kind of thing. But it's helpful just get in there and see what is going on here, and what's the scene, what's the dialogue, what's the setting. And that's the setting of the narrative. Consider the geography of the text. Is there any mention of place names? I think, Jake, you mentioned earlier, we don't know these places, but why are they there? I can think of one where it says, they went up to Jerusalem, and you always wonder, why are they going up? Because it's just on an elevation. So stuff like that. There are details mentioned in the text. Is there time sequence? Is there sequencing there of time? It's like a movie, and that was their genre back then. The story was their form of movie telling, storytelling. So their sequences could help. Look for the flow, the beginning, middle, end. Is there a flashback, or is there change of time sequence? And again, identifying the protagonist, antagonist, the foil, it can help. Are there any other peripheral characters that are mentioned that adds to the value of the narrative? Again, pay attention to dialogue. Is there repetition of phrases? Is there irony? Is there satire? Consider the emotional texture of the narrative. I mean, this is a deeply emotional story of Joseph. I mean, this young boy eventually, becomes obviously a grown man, but is his life tragic, or is it victory? But he's gone through a lot, and there's a lot of emotions there, and the story tells you that. Especially the reunion scene with his brothers. I don't know how you can get emotional when you read it. It's quite, it's a tearjerker. Imagine a movie at the end, and you have this scene. And what I find is when I'm rushing through my Bible study, I miss everything. But when I just sit and I want to get into the text, then I can bring myself emotionally into the scene, the reunification scene, and he's then seeing his brothers, and he's trying to, pretend that he's not, and he, it's deeply emotional, and he sees his dad, and it's an incredibly moving story. And again, look for surprises. Like Joseph ends up in prison. And again, when you're doing a campus or teen devotional, we don't always get rewarded for the right decisions we make. I mean, this man withstood great temptation, and you would think he would be rewarded, like God will reward him, and yet he ends up in prison. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, seriously, I was in a ditch, I'm sold in slavery, now I'm doing the right thing. And how many times we want to leave God because of that, whether it be for ourselves or those we minister to. That God's unfair. You know, I became a disciple. I really thought I'd get good grades in class or in my school. I'd make great friends and I'll have a better life, a simpler life. But the minute I became a disciple, my life has been nothing but trouble. Yes. Now again, we don't want to just jump to Joseph and say, well, you know, let me teach you about Joseph, and so you stop complaining. You know, I have done that because I've had low EQ, and I've grown by God's grace, increasing my EQ a little bit, and I'm sure you guys have much higher EQ than I ever did. But just in case, probably not the best time to jump to Joseph, because you would be right, but probably not very relational, and you know, but you listen and so on and so forth. But at some point you want to take them to Joseph's, or even ask them, hey, why don't you read Joseph's story? It's a great story of these surprise endings that shouldn't be, but it is. And then what's the narrative doing? What's it doing? And you'll see Joseph swimming upstream. He really is not swimming in the cultural river. He's definitely not drowning, but he's choosing to swim upstream. And there's so much there that we can learn from him.